Everyone, thank you for joining us today for our webinar, The Dollar and Cents of Parks and Recreation. This is our second webinar in the three-part series, A Fresh Start, sponsored by SmartRoute. My name is Allison. I'll be the host today. I'm the Director of Partnerships at SmartRec by Amelia. So before we go any further, I just want to go over a couple of technical details. The webinar will be recorded. You'll all receive a copy via email within the next couple of days. As the audience, you will be placed on mute. You'll find a chat box and a question box in the control panel of the webinar of GoToWebinar. So if you have questions throughout or technical difficulties throughout, feel free to write in the question box or the chat box. And then we'll also have a question period at the very end of the webinar. So for those of you who joined us last week, Liz took us through why resident journey mapping is crucial and how the mapping exercise can be done with your staff. Today, we're joined by Jamie Sabak, president of 110%. With her over 30 years of experience in the field as a practitioner, educator, and consultant, Jamie's going to walk us through the critical importance of financial discipline within parks and recreation. Jamie, with that, I will pass it off to you.
Great, thank you, Alice. I appreciate it, and good morning or afternoon to all of you, depending on which time zone in which you reside. Appreciate your time, appreciate your attention in the midst of everything that else is going on, and also a bit of online fatigue. So thanks for your commitment to this conversation and this topic in particular. I'm going to start out with a little bit of engagement here. We're actually going to have 3 touch points with all of you today, but I'm going to pass the mic quickly back to Allison. She's going to actually post a couple of questions for you to respond to, so that'll get us started.
All right, thanks, Jamie. So I'm going to launch the first poll. The question is going to be, are you concerned about the financial future of your organization? Go ahead and launch it. And I'll give about a minute for people to go ahead and put in their responses.
Allison, I'm not seeing the poll. I'm not sure if everyone else is.
Yeah, it looks like people, I'm at 80%, 82% have voted. I'm going to give it another 10, 15 seconds. All right. And I'm going to share those responses. So it looks like 93% of you said yes and 7% at no.
All right. Well, thanks for playing. I think that's a good place for us to begin and obviously set the stage for this topic of financial discipline, of course, the dollars and cents of parks and recreation. I find it a critically important issue to address on the front end of any discussion today around how we are investing taxpayer resources and how we're thinking about revenue generation to continue to process and come to some conclusions in response around this question as to whether or not public parks and recreation are essential services. And in a very kind of provocative way, I will tell you that I am not convinced as a 30+ year professional that parks and recreation as a whole can be considered an essential service. I think there are certainly things that we do and provide to communities and afford communities that could certainly fall into the bucket of must-haves, right? That require investment of taxpayer resources, of the finite fiscal resources we have available to us. But I think we're a little more hard-pressed to suggest that things like yoga classes and things like daddy-daughter dances and a variety of other types of activities we provide really are must-haves in this moment in time. And continuing on the plane of this question concerning essential, we've got to understand as a profession what this term means to us. It's helpful to define this term because we find ourselves engaged in meetings with senior administrators and city council members and board members and city administrators around what is essential and what is not today. If we think about essential in its true kind of pure raw sense, it means it's absolutely necessary. And if we're to translate that terminology to parks and recreation, we may conclude that park and recreation services that are absolutely necessary to community quality of life would be those essential services we provide. These are the services that might be critical to preserving life, health, and basic social function in our organizations and in our communities. And this in and of itself provides us a different lens through which to look and think about how should we be investing taxpayer dollars, particularly in this moment in time, in the midst of a pandemic, significant social unrest, economic uncertainty, and so on. To further this conversation about how do we need to begin thinking or maybe continue to think differently about the investment of taxpayer dollars and be as fiscally responsible and financially disciplined as we can be, I think it behooves us to take a look at a study that was done just a few years ago to help us better understand where we are today and how we might think differently. So what I'm sharing with you high level is a snapshot of some results of a research study done by Penn State University, and in particular, Dr. Andy Mowen and his team back in 2017. And they essentially interviewed over 800 policymakers in local government about whether or not they believe Parks and Recreation was essential, was a necessary service within communities. And you can see some of the results here again at a high level. 95% of those who responded said they personally used their local park systems. 99% agreed that their communities benefited from these local park systems. And while these government officials said that Parks and Recreation was truly a solution to some of their top issues facing their communities, this goes back to the benefits are endless movement. Those of you that have been in the profession for a couple of decades, remember, we did all of this study around whether or not we were affecting youth crime rates and whether or not we contributed to quality of life. These are statements and stories we've been telling for years, and these people believe that we truly are a solution in our communities. But at the same time, they were less likely to view Parks and Recreation as a contribution to their number one concern, which was the economy. And think about that today. Think about the stories we've told about how we contribute to the economy in our communities, how we are one of those catalysts for attracting local businesses community. Yet these administrators, these policymakers suggested that they didn't see us through that lens. And while 6 and 7 of these folks agreed that Parks and Recreation was well worth the dollar spent on it, they indicated that Parks and Recreation would likely be hit with the largest cut in funding when the city, town, county suffered budgetary pressures. Now think about that today. Again, this was in 2017. This was, a decade, almost a decade after the last recession. And it was 3 years prior to what we see now as our next recession. And in some cases, some are considering this the precursor to a depression in 2021 and so on. Now, I think it's important for us to look at some of the data before we really get into what do we need to do to be as financially disciplined as we possibly can be, to look at the data that resulted from NRPA's questions of all of us over the last 6 months. So they've been doing these NRPA park snapshots. I want to believe most of you, if not all of you on the line, know National Recreation and Park Association as our mothership, our membership organization. We're very diligent in reaching out, asking how everyone was doing and what kind of reductions were you facing and how is this going to affect capital investment and so on. So the last week of June, they unveiled some of the results of your feedback as professionals in our arena. And 66%, or 2 in 3 of agencies, are facing operational budget reductions in this moment, with the median reduction being 10 to 19%. And again, think back, these results were from a few months ago, so we've yet to see the updates. Nearly 1 in 5 agencies are reducing operations spending by at least 30%. 57% of our agencies are facing capital budget reductions, with the median reduction being between 50 and 59%. And 1 in 5 agencies are reporting that their capital budgets have been zeroed out. Now, that's not just about placing moratorium on new build. That means they're not investing in their existing infrastructure. So think back to 2017 when we were realizing, based upon some research, that, we were not necessarily top of the food chain in terms of receiving taxpayer resources. And now we see the reality in this moment in time that organizations are further challenged with budgetary restrictions, budgetary reductions. We're playing from a new playing field, right? The rules have changed, and it's incumbent upon us to accept and embrace this new reality that we're in the midst of. So I like to think about it as we've got to stop asking for what does not exist. If the money's not there, the money's not there. Rather, we're in a position now to do better with what we have. And it's going to require us being bold, being courageous, and having to make some, frankly, unpopular decisions moving forward, or recommendations. I also want to kind of finish up, if you will, setting the stage for this content with a very unfortunate example of a lack of financial discipline in our field. I noticed some of you on the line have been part of the master classes that I've been doing over the last 7 months, 6-7 months, and you've heard the details of this case study. But what I think is important for all of us to recognize, particularly those of you that have served in areas of this country where money's really not been an issue. Maybe over the last decade, you've been building like crazy, right? You've been building and growing and people are moving in and it's great. And you're getting to celebrate all these new, bright, shiny things and you're adding services to your menu. We look at Portland Parks and Recreation as a classic example of what could happen to any of us in any moment. We can have a life lesson here, a learned lesson. Portland in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s was an organization many wanted to emulate. They were considered a role model institution in public parks and recreation. People wanted to know, what was Portland doing? How was Portland doing? And what we find is in this last decade, they find themselves now in a state of financial crisis. You can see, based upon this illustration alone, that between 2013 and 2018, their expenditures were outpacing their revenues by 21%. Now, if we all looked at this image as a snapshot of our own checkbooks, right, our own personal fiscal reality, we would have hit pause a long time ago, right? We would have called stop, or we would be bankrupt. And this is where we're finding some of the most prolific, again, flagship institutions in parks and recreation finding themselves in this moment in time. So we've got to do what we can to avoid this unfortunate reality. And it's incumbent upon all of us to take responsibility for the fiscal conditions of our systems, being smart and intelligent about how we invest taxpayer resources, because at the end of the day, this is a legacy effort around the future of parks and recreation. So we have an opportunity in this moment in time to write the next story, right? Change the narrative and not be among those who wait for someone or some entities to tell us what we need to do or how much we need to reduce. Rather, begin to take control of a situation that at times can feel a bit out of control. We have a chance to assume more responsibility and more control than we realize we have. So this is a very ambitious topic. Obviously, we're going to be covering a ton in a very short period of time. But I'm going to be sharing with you some insights, perspectives based upon these 3 subtopics. First is really paying attention and understanding where we are today. What have been the realities and challenges our profession has faced over the last couple of decades, and in some ways how they've been compounded based upon the pandemic. Second, focusing on impact and whether or not we really have had the impacts that we need to have on our communities. Have we made the right choices in terms of investment? And then finally, some thoughts and strategies about how we can optimize our resources, particularly, obviously, our fiscal resources. So let's start here with paying attention. And I've summarized a lot of different things, and this is not an exhaustive list, but a lot of different conditions and realities that we're in the midst of in this moment in time. And please understand, all of these are symptoms of bigger problems and bigger issues. These are not the problems in and of themselves. First, we all recognize none of us have a crystal ball. None of us are Nostradamus. We really don't know when the dust settles what the economy is going to look like. But what we do know and what we can all agree on is we have a significant amount of economic uncertainty. So we've got to be careful about playing with fire and assuming that everything is going to be okay pretty quickly and the floodgates are going to open again. We've got to recognize, embrace, and understand that the economics of our country, right, and our systems are very questionable in this moment. In addition to that, not that we didn't have enough disparity and need in communities prior to the pandemic, but now we've seen an increase in these areas, increasing disparities, increases between the haves and have-nots, and increasing need in our community. Need meaning, again, the must-haves, right, the essential things that communities must have. Right now, many people are focused on putting food on the table and paying the rent. So we've got to be very thoughtful about how we can respond and react to the needs in our communities and not just the demands, the desires, and the expectations. We know that we've got a lack of revenue diversification in our profession. We've been talking about this for decades. We are an organized entity, if you will, Parks and Recreation professional, Parks and Recreation as a profession at the public level is heavily dependent on taxpayer resources. And while that varies from community to community, certainly, and region to region, we know as a profession we are heavily dependent on taxpayer dollars. We've got, admittedly, limited financial literacy in our profession. We don't have a lot of business acumen. We're social servants, right? We have big social service hearts, and sometimes we don't balance that very well with management principles and business practices. And we've got to do a better job of embellishing internal conversations around understanding the finances of it all, right? You can't write the checks, nothing else matters. I say that all the time. We've also got uninformed constituencies. It was interesting. I was watching 60 Minutes the other day, and Barack Obama was talking about his new book, and he mentioned this fact that government has struggled over decades with having uninformed constituents, uninformed citizens, uninformed taxpayers. What's government doing with our money becomes the question. And we have to own some responsibility for them not understanding how we function and how we invest their resources. We also have unreasonable expectations on behalf of our communities, which connects with uninformed constituencies. People believe simply by virtue of paying taxes, it entitles them to anything that they want. We've got maintenance backlogs out of control. I'm going to be going into some detail about this shortly. Our society as a whole, right? Our infrastructure has been in crisis for decades. We've got crumbling roads and bridges and questionable water sources and so on. So we've got to understand we've got maintenance backlogs we've got to address. And we also have struggling competitors. In this moment, we've got the private sector struggling to keep its doors open. The nonprofits are struggling, understanding that philanthropy is it's not what it once was, and so on. And we've got to work hard to help our competitors, potential partners, really rise up above this. Because at the end of the day, if a private sector organization or business goes out of business and they're paying taxes, we're allowing essentially the dilution of our tax resources that support our own systems. So how can we think differently about our competitors as partners and really embrace them? And the list goes on. And this is not intended to be doom and gloom. This is for us all to understand our realities in this moment in time, because it allows us further to create the strategies we will need to move forward, right? So it's an opportunity for us today. The future relies on the choices that we make moving forward, and we've got to avoid the lemming syndrome. We've followed one another for many years. We look to each other. How are you doing this? What are you doing here? NRPA Connect, as noble as it is, sometimes has become that place where we go for resources and we just essentially cut and paste. We put our logo on it and then we use it. We've got to be more strategic, more thoughtful, and more intelligent about the choices we're making for our systems and our communities moving forward. So let's look at impact. At the end of the day, the question becomes, how are we spending taxpayer resources, and are we having the impacts we need to have on our communities? I think it's important for all of us to take a step back and think about what is it that people expect of us. And the two things you see on the screen here are the basic expectations of taxpayers of their government. Right, we want our government, as a taxpayer, we want our government to take care of our common resources, our environment, take care of our roads, our bridges, our water infrastructure, and so on, our parks. And we want our government to impact social issues and address conflicts, things like the health and wellness of our society, right? The health indicators on behalf of our citizenry, equity issues in our communities. So let's take a closer look at these, and let's tie this specifically to the profession of parks and recreation and public parks and recreation. If we look at NRPA, again, our mothership, our national membership mothership, we see that the three pillars of our profession are health and wellness, equity, and conservation. And we can see a direct link and a conduit between these pillars and the expectations of all of us as citizens of our government, right? We're saying as a profession, we're going to lead the way in terms of improving health and wellness. We're saying we're going to ensure people have access to services. And we're suggesting we're going to focus on conservation, right? Protecting our open spaces and our infrastructure, our public infrastructure as it relates to parks and recreation. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to take a step back and look at how we're doing as it relates to these pillars. So I'm going to focus on two examples and two examples only. And I know a few of you, again, that were part of the master class, this is a bit of a repeat message. As my mother used to say, repetition causes retention. So maybe you'll enjoy it the second go round. So let's look at obesity in the United States, right? One of our principal health indicators today. You think about the opioid crisis, you can think about diabetes, but we're going to look at obesity, a huge health and wellness indicator. The four maps you see on the screen all came from the Centers for Disease Control. The one on the top left, 1986, this was actually the second map that came out of the CDC. And it was an illustration and an indication that we as a society were starting to question some disturbing trends around obesity. You can see the white states, the data, the jury was out. We didn't have the data to support, the amount of people or the percentage of population that were possibly clinically obese in communities at that point. But we were just kind of exploring. We were getting a little worried. Fast forward 8 years to 1994, you can see CDC now puts out its new model, and we see now that all states have some kind of coloring to them. right? And we're seeing a trend, and a disturbing trend. We're seeing, an escalation in the number of people, or the percent of population in states that were considered clinically obese. Fast forward to 2002 in the bottom left, again, the trend continues, and the trend is moving in the wrong direction. We're now starting to suggest that within the next few years, we're going to have some states at 30% of their population being considered clinically obese. Top right, or bottom right rather, 2009, we now have a number of states that have plus 30% or more of their population being considered clinically obese. Fast forward to today, we look at 2019. This map came out in the spring of this year. And now we're looking at a colored box that's suggesting we're going to start looking at states having 60% of their population being clinically obese. And finally, within 10 years, the suggestion now is that we're going to have 8 states in the United States that are going to have 60% of their population being considered clinically obese. Now, some of you might be saying, what in the world does this have to do with financial discipline? Well, it has everything to do with financial discipline, because the question becomes, if one of our pillars of our profession is health and wellness, and we are expected to lead efforts around the health of our society and the health of our communities, we've got to ask ourselves, how are we doing? How are we doing relative to impacting and influencing the health and wellness of our communities? Have we made smart investment choices on behalf of our communities? Now, we're not the only ones in the game. I'm not suggesting that this is all our fault and we should take full responsibility. However, we do have some responsibility if we're going to hang our hats on being a health and wellness profession. And we're not the only ones involved in this exercise, and not the only ones that have some responsibility. We know that there's school vending machines and fast food restaurants and personal responsibility and food deserts and lack of access and poor communities, and the list goes on in terms of the barriers and the constraints to eating well and taking care of ourselves and being a healthy community. But we've got to ask whether or not the investments we've made were smart and responsible. Let's look at one of the other pillars, and let's look at infrastructure, conservation. Okay, again, this is a bit of a look in the mirror for all of us. So the image you see on the screen is representative of an article that came out in Outdoor Magazine online in 2018, July of 2018. And the suggestion, as you can see, is that the National Park Service needs $11.6 billion to take care of its maintenance backlog. Now, the interesting things here that I want to point out are, number one, a study came out in 2012 through the Epley Institute of Indiana University that suggested that we needed $12 billion to take care of our maintenance backlog. Again, that was in 2012. We can also suggest that over the window of time between 2012 and 2020, then the federal government has not invested that much in the maintenance backlog of the National Park Service. Meaning, if we do some basic math and compounding, we understand that the figure is probably not $12 billion. In addition, there was another study done back in 2012 that suggested the backlog was not $12 billion, rather it was $80 billion. And if that is the case, and we have put little into the maintenance backlog of the National Park Service, that means that we could be approaching $160 billion in maintenance backlog by the year 2026. What we have to ask ourselves is, how did we get here? In addition to, of course, where is the money going to come from to take care of the maintenance backlog? But how in the world did we get here, and what choices were made or what things were not done that got us to this place in time? Now let's look at this at a more local level. Okay, some of you on the line I recognize are from the state of Texas. This is probably not news to you. The city of Austin, who, it's a city that was growing by 110 people per day just 7-8 years ago. Austin is seen as an incredibly progressive community, flagship Whole Foods, got a lot going on. The music scene's fantastic. But at the underbelly, there was a recognition that the city council in particular was not making informed decisions and very smart decisions about investing in their infrastructure. They now are in a place where they need over $1 billion to take care of their maintenance backlog. Now, they've also got 30 plus outdoor aquatic facilities where the average age is 50 years. Again, we've got to ask ourselves, how in the world did this happen? How did we get to this point in time? We can look at the state park system of Pennsylvania as well as an example of an organization and a system burdened by an incredible maintenance backlog. In December of 19, just 11 months ago now, they came out and stated they needed $1 billion to take care of their existing infrastructure. And I want to know that they were awarded the National Gold Medal just a couple of years ago. And finally, talk about a flagship system, the city of New York, Central Park, this iconic system in the United States, who came out in 2018 and said, you know what, we need $6 billion to take care of our existing backlog. So again, we've got to ask ourselves what happened, what didn't happen that allowed these systems and many others to accumulate such an incredible, devastating amount of backlog, and where is this going to take them? What are they going to need to do moving forward to be able to either take care of their infrastructure or manage their system in the most responsible way, given now the deficits and the debt that they've incurred? And finally, I want to wrap this part of this conversation up, right, and focusing on impact with this. And I recognize this is quite provocative, and it's absolutely necessary that we really analyze the effectiveness of the Great Outdoors Act. Quite a few months ago, many celebrations on LinkedIn and Facebook suggesting that this was going to be the panacea to us taking care of our infrastructure. But I think we have to understand that there's great insufficiency of the Great Outdoors Act. The suggestion that this is going to fully and permanently fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund at $900 million per year is questionable. If we look simply at the infrastructure needs of just the few examples I shared with you on the screen, we understand that that's an insufficient amount of money, and we cannot rely on the federal government to bail us out. In addition, this provision of $9.5 billion over 5 years, or approximately $2 billion annually, to address the maintenance backlog of the National Park Service, again, is insufficient. If we assume that it's only $12 billion, then it's still insufficient. But we all recognize what's happened to the National Park Service just in the last 7 months, the amount of foot traffic, the visitations because of the pandemic, the carved out social trails that once did not exist that have done nothing but compound the maintenance demands and needs in the national parks has only accelerated that total. The bottom line is we have to think differently about the choices we're making with the money we have. Are we building and kind of forgiving and foregoing investing in existing infrastructure? Are we subsidizing special events, knowing that we've got incredible needs in our communities, things like the obesity crisis, which now actually the College of Physicians is calling, American College of Physicians is calling an obesity plague? We've got to think about the choices we're making, the investment choices and the spending choices we're making, and whether or not they are the most responsible, effective things for us to be investing in, right, at the end of the day. So I'm going to hit pause. I'm going to pass this back to Allison. We have a couple questions for you specific to impacts in community and infrastructure.
Thank you, Jamie. So I'm going to launch the first one. First question is, in your job, do you practice financial discipline all day, every day? And it is open. Again, I'll give it about 45 seconds. We're at 65% voted, so I will give a couple more seconds and then close it. All right. And sharing it. So 56% of you said yes, 44% no. Jamie, do you want me to launch the second poll right away?
Yeah, there's two questions, right?
Yeah. So second question, do you believe your director, colleagues, advisory board, and policymakers understand the critical importance of financial discipline? And I have launched it. You guys are very close on this one. It's almost split so far, 50-50. Giving it a couple more seconds. I still see some votes coming in. All right, closing it. And on this one, 53% of you said yes and 47% no, so quite close.
Great. Thanks, Allison.
My pleasure.
All right. So shared a bit about, what's happening around us, obviously realities, conditions, how they've been compounded based upon the pandemic. Took a look at just a couple of realities, if you will, issues that our communities are facing today and our organizations are facing today, and what choices we're making around investing in those kinds of things in order, again, to have the greatest impact on the community. But this whole conversation, this topic, if you will, is on optimizing resources, right? It's how do we optimize what we have available to us? Again, where we stop thinking about getting more and we think more about how do we best use what we have. So where do we start? Well, first of all, and started to brand this way of thinking, this is a bigger conversation than just cost recovery. We recognize cost recovery is a part of this, and I'm going to share some thoughts with you about cost recovery strategy here shortly. But this, at the end of the day, is how we as a profession are choosing to manage, or how we will choose to manage our fiscal resources moving forward, right? And they're finite today. We used to, after 2008, we were saying we had limited fiscal resources, limited finite resources. Today, now we're starting to use language around finite fiscal resources. Again, what we have available to us rather than the expectation we're going to get more from the general fund or more from the tax trough, as they say. The optimism around this, and the thing that, this is a lane I've been in for a while now, and I have to say the incredible optimism here is that we're seeing a movement towards financial discipline. And whether it's simply because we've been devastated and we recognize things are likely not going to go back to the way they were, whatever the reason is, or maybe some organizations are desperate in this moment in time, we're starting to see more organizations gravitating towards this conversation. And this was for a while a conversation just many did not want to have. And now we're seeing, again, a movement towards this commitment to financial discipline in the profession. And I think that's an incredible thing to hang our hats on and a thing to get excited about in this moment in time. So I want to look at cost recovery in particular. I'm going to share some thoughts about how we can strategically move the needle towards being more thoughtful around how we're spending taxpayer dollars and how we're thinking about revenue generation. So if we think about cost recovery of yesterday, as I like to call it, and I know some of you on the line are younger professionals, others are seasoned like myself. We've got different perspectives on this, but I want to take you down memory lane here very briefly. And what I share with you on the screen was one of our first efforts as a profession to start thinking about cost recovery. And this came out at a time when we really didn't have to think about it. We were doing pretty well. We were building like crazy. It wasn't a concern of many in the profession, other than if you happen to be a nerd and somebody who liked this kind of stuff like me. People went, oh, okay, that's nice, that's interesting. But I was excited about it. I was excited. I was the Director of Recreation and Community Services for the city of Bloomington, Indiana, and I was jazzed that we were starting to talk about cost recovery. We as a system and an institution were starting to talk about cost recovery in our area. And so we saw these benchmarks, if you will, come out in, I want to say it was the early 90s. And we saw that parks was going to be a 0 to 10%, youth sports at 50%, and so on. And while this was a noble effort and it was important to opening the gates to this kind of work and this kind of thinking, we recognized in short time that this was not a universal approach that could be applied, and we saw some challenges and failures with this approach. Simply because the expectation here was Bloomington, Indiana was going to have the same cost recovery expectation as the Woodlands, Texas, or the same cost recovery expectation as Napa, California, or the same cost recovery expectation as Lexington, Massachusetts. And we know that's not realistic. Our fiscal conditions, our economic realities are different, our demographics are different, community needs were different, and so on the story went. So again, while this was noble in intention, and it was really a good thing for us in many ways, we found that there were some significant holes in theory and application. So today we can think about cost recovery through different kinds of lenses, and I present to you one way of thinking about this application, right? How can we strategically, methodically, thoughtfully make decisions around investment of taxpayer resources, and how can we do the same relative to revenue generation and revenue enhancement? So this is a methodology we use. Again, it's a methodology, but it's one that we are quite proud of, and it's one that's been supported through evaluation by Penn State. And it's simply built on the back of, if you will, or on the top of 3 legs. So we refer to it as a 3-legged stool. And this is your organization's ability to create categories that represent your service menu, your organization's commitment and effort to connect the dots between the services you provide and who benefits in your community from those services. And then, of course, understanding cost of service. And I'm not going to get into all the details of cost of service today because that's obviously a program in and of itself. But the important thing to understand is we're starting to look at indirect and direct costs more intelligently, and more responsibly than we have before. So let's break the legs down just for a couple of minutes. I want to get into some of the details of what are categories, beneficiary of service, and so on. So first of all, service categories provide us a different lens through which to see our menu of services. If you think about a traditional, conventional parks and recreation system today, we have service areas within our organizations, right? We have our sports division, we have our aquatics division, we have an events office, we have a senior center, and so on the story goes. We have our parks division, right? And functionally and operationally, those divisions and areas make all the sense in the world, right? Like speaks to like. But when it comes to making decisions around investment of taxpayer resources, subsidy investment, when it comes to how we're going to price services and so on, it becomes hugely problematic for us. In addition, special interests tend to drive decisions in our organizations around those areas. So for example, and I use this often, let's say the mayor of our town, USA, happens to be the president of the local Little League. Well, guess what service we tend to avoid at all costs, or guess which service we are worried about increasing fees for, and so on the story goes. Or I'm the board president and I'm a senior who goes to the senior center every day. Same narrative, right? So categorization looks at our services through a different lens, and it allows us to find ways to diminish social values debates and help us more confidently address cost recovery and revenue generation. So the example on the screen is simply to suggest we've got a sport on the left, right? The little boy, let's suggest he's a t-ball player. Those are quite the uniforms for a t-ball player, but nonetheless, let's just go with it. He's a t-baller. And on the right, we have a little girl who's in an intro dance class. Let's throw me in the mix here, and let's say that I'm going to take a swim lesson. This is a true story. I don't like water. I'm not a fan. I don't like pools, but it's a bucket list thing for me. I feel like I should learn how to swim. So I'm going to take a swim class as an adult. And then let's say Anna's dad is 75 years old and he wants to take a guitar lesson for the first time in his life, right? He's 75, he's a senior. Now, in our traditional conventional way of thinking about cost recovery, we'd have 4 buckets. We'd have seniors, we'd have aquatics, we'd have youth sports, the little boy on the left, and we have dance, the little girl on the right. And we'd have different cost recovery expectations. In our conventional model, youth sports is at 50%, dance is at 75%, aquatics is at 50%, and seniors is at 25%. And we've got to ask ourselves why. Where did those numbers come from? More often than not, we establish arbitrary cost recovery goals, and we set arbitrary fees a lot. Categories allow us to look at those 4 services I just used as an example through the same lens. Youth sports, and this T-ball program in particular, is a learn to kind of activity, right? It's introductory, it's beginner level. The dance class for this little girl is an introductory level activity, right? It's a skill-based activity that's introductory and beginner level. Swim lesson for somebody even my age is a learn to swim program, right? It's introductory. And the beginner guitar lesson for the older adult is a beginner level activity. So now we start to categorize based upon the level of service rather than the individual area or type of service, and it diminishes social values debates. So it's a different lens through which we look. Once we have created categories that represent our organization, and we want to define them and we want to create examples so all of us see them similarly, right? There's no misinterpretation of what they are, what they represent. We then want to connect our categories with who benefits. And this is a very common practice. This is not new. It's been a way our economy, if you will, has functioned for decades. Economists in the US economy have thought about beneficiary of service in terms of aligning product and service with benefit. So it's not a new way of thinking. So if we take our service categories in our organizations and we begin to think about who benefits, it allows us to align those decisions then with how we should invest taxpayer resources and how we might think about revenue generating. So let's look at this example. The 2 examples on the screen, the 2 services represented on the screen are intended to represent aquatics programs, right? On the left, let's say this little boy is part of our Learn to Swim program. And let's say on the right, this young lady is part of our master swim team or competitive swim team. And while they're both aquatics programs, and if we think conventionally about cost recovery, we'd put them in the 50% cost recovery bucket, I think we would all recognize that there's a different beneficiary to these kinds of activities. The little boy on the left representing Learn to Swim program, there's a greater opportunity for more access to that kind of activity on behalf of a larger portion of our community, right? So we might say it aligns more with the community benefit than individual benefit. In contrast, the service on the right, it's specialized, it's discretionary, right? It's individualized. You have to have a particular mastery of skill in order to participate. So we might suggest that simply by virtue of the fact that you have to have a mastery of skill, it limits access. Therefore, it's more specialized, individualized. And at the end of the day, we can use beneficiary of service to help make decisions and determine where we should be investing taxpayer resources. Clearly, if there's a service that's more accessible to a greater portion of our community, we're probably going to be able to justify and rationalize a greater investment of taxpayer dollars. In contrast to services that are more individualized, more specialized, are less accessible, and they have more barriers and constraints, we're likely not going to be able to justify and rationalize a greater investment of taxpayer dollars. They may even present us with an opportunity to generate excess revenues, if you will. And what this allows us to do, and we use an image to represent our strategy, it allows us to begin to plot our categories on a continuum, if you will, from the bottom left, categories providing for the greatest community benefit or aligning most with our common good. Again, being things that are more essential, they have community-wide interests, they have far-reaching impacts, more universal value, and they're accessible for all, to categories in the top right that tend to be more discretionary, serve a special interest or a self-interest, they're more exclusive, and so on. And this allows us, again, to begin thinking about where can we justify and rationalize a greater portion of our tax resource investment. And finally, as you all know, the critical importance in the underbelly of any strategy around how we're going to invest taxpayer resources and how we're going to think about revenue enhancement is we've got to understand what things cost our systems. And this is all costs today. This is no longer just direct costs. This is something, again, that we're seeing a big change. We're seeing a movement in our profession. I liken how the public sector has thought about costs to that of a teenage driver. Again, some of you I know have heard me talk about this before, repeat messaging here. Many of us were teenage drivers. Some of us have had teenage drivers in the household. Some of you are about to have teenage drivers in the household. But at the end of the day, we probably recognize that teenage drivers believe the only cost associated with operating a motor vehicle is gas. And they forget that, you got to plate the car and you got to, register and insure the car, and ultimately you're going to have to replace the car. The public sector has done itself a disservice in terms of articulating cost recovery only in terms of direct costs, because we're not telling the true story and we're misrepresenting reality and we're misleading our constituents. So today we're starting to see that we're being more responsible and committed to understanding all costs associated with service delivery. The executive director of an organization is not free. It just doesn't happen to get paid by some bucket of money. It's an expense of a system, and be methodical around understanding all costs associated with service delivery. And there are ways we can do this today that allow us to optimize our staff resources and do this in a very efficient, effective way. So where this leads us is to create this subsidy allocation and cost recovery strategy. Again, subsidy allocation, how are we spending taxpayer dollars? Cost recovery, how are we thinking about offsetting the expenses associated with our services? It gives us a place to begin, and it gives us a foundation from which we can start to communicate and establish a baseline for how we're going to spend taxpayer dollars and think about revenue. So we build upon our beneficiary of service model, which I shared just a few slides ago. Once we've done our cost of service analysis, it tells us what does it cost us to provide services. It illustrates for us what our current performance levels are, which allows us then to make informed, intelligent decisions about what our goals can be moving forward. Right? I find it fascinating over the years as a 20-year practicing professional and the last 10 as an educator and a consultant. We've got so many organizations making arbitrary decisions about what cost recovery goals are when they don't know what their current performance levels are. And I liken it to me wanting to run a marathon. I may have aspirations to run 26 miles, but if I can't haul my happy hind end around the block, I may want to start with a 5K, right? I've got to understand what I'm doing in this moment in time in order to set reasonable, realistic goals moving forward. I want to share an example of a model come to life that was just completed a month or so ago, and this is the city of Wheat Ridge, Colorado. I know we've got some Colorado folks on the line here. This is a model that they created based upon the methodology I just shared with you. They created categories to represent their entire menu of services. You can see there's only a handful of categories here. Some people ask me often, what how many categories are the right number of categories to represent our service menu. The fewest I've ever seen was 9, and that was for the city of Austin with over 10,000 courses, classes, events, activities. And the most I've ever seen was 15 for the city of Milwaukee's Recreation and Community Services Division. So it's not one size fits all, but we want to create categories that represent our menus. But this organization created their categories, identified definitions and examples so that everyone read them similarly and understood them similarly. They did a comprehensive cost of service analysis to understand what the cost recovery performance for every service within each category was, which allowed them then obviously to establish credible goals. And of course, the ranking on the continuum was done based upon who benefits. Who benefits, the community as a whole, the common good, or is it more individualized in nature? But this becomes the strategy that they will employ in terms of direction around investing taxpayer resources, exhibiting financial discipline at the end of the day. So I want to close with some insights, some thoughts, and then we're going to open it up for general thoughts, comments, questions, and they certainly don't have to be questions of me. They just may be general comments you'd like to share with your colleagues on the line. But one of the things I've found over the years, again, Allison mentioned I've been in the field 30 plus years, which is hard to believe. I started as a sports coordinator, and now I find myself working with agencies all across the country, is we have a propensity to get in our own way. And we've got to get out of our own way if we're going to see the light, as they say. It sounds so spiritual, but we've got to change some of the things that we do, and we've got to shift some of our thinking if we're actually going to move this agenda forward and become more fiscally responsible and exhibit financial discipline in our profession. The first thing I share, again, some of you have heard this before, I'm a huge fan of this theory called tragedy of the commons. If you are a park and recreation professional and you do not know this theory, you should know this theory. It's incumbent upon you to understand this theory because it has everything to do with our reality today. I'm going to summarize it very briefly. Tragedy of the common was a theory created by ecologist in 1968. His name was Garrett Hardin. And essentially the messaging behind tragedy of the common, or at the underbelly of tragedy of the common, is individual exploitation of common resources invites overall ruin. Again, individual exploitation of common resource invites overall ruin. And while at the time this theory was built around the notion of environmental exploitation, right? Our lands, our public lands, our water, and so on. Today, we as a profession are beginning to think about it in terms of the individual exploitation of our common resources, and in particular, our money, right? Taxpayer dollars. The notion here is, this farmer and this cow see that, they can use this property, this land, we all own it, it's accessible to all. But we find that others begin to take advantage of this land. And ultimately what happens is we've got the overall ruin of this common resource because we've had individual exploitation, overuse. We think about this in a very practical example that applies to almost everyone on this call today, and most of us in the park and recreation world. We can think about youth sports. And youth sports in the vein of us charging them $25 to use fields that cost us tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to maintain. And I will tell you right now, full disclosure, I am a sporty, I was a competitive ball player, I officiated. I love youth sports. I love sports and everything that it means, everything good that it means. But youth sports organizations across the country exploit their local park and recreation systems, and we're afraid to charge them a going rate or a market rate. We're afraid to ruffle feathers. We're afraid to make unpopular decisions. And when we allow them to exploit our finite resources, it comes at a price, because many of us would acknowledge we're not meeting the needs of our communities. We're not able to provide needs-based assistance to the degree we need to. We're not investing in our infrastructure as much as we should, and so on the story goes. That's one example, but it illustrates the importance of this tragedy of the commons theory. And again, individual exploitation or individual overuse, essentially inviting overall ruin of our systems and our institutions. So it's important for us to understand that this is a critical consideration in today's realities. The other two things I want to touch on briefly are the notion of ability to pay versus willingness to pay, and the fairness effect. Very quickly, we have huge conflicts in communities across the country between ability to pay and willingness to pay. In a society where we have 1% of our population owning 50% of Wall Street and the market, we clearly have people in our society who have an ability to pay. They just may not want to pay. And we can think about populations like older adults in society in general. Older adults have greater amount of discretionary income than any other, yet we're afraid to raise senior lunch fees from $1 to $2. And we've got to ask ourselves why. And in addition to that, the fairness effect, which I mentioned earlier, is simply I pay taxes, therefore government owes me. I pay taxes, therefore I want a yoga class, I want an archery range, I want this, I want that. And we have, again, done a disservice in terms of informing our constituents about what their tax dollars actually pay for or subsidize, and what they can subsidize and what they frankly cannot. So these are a couple of things that we have the ability to address and affect. And I think as professionals in this field, we have a moral imperative to do just that. So I want to wrap things up with this, and that's our control over tomorrow's narrative. First of all, we have become essentially over decades a profession and a public sector entity that is something for everyone all the time. And we can no longer do that if we're going to do a good job. We've really got to tone down our service menus. We've got to be more thoughtful and responsible about what is our lane, right? What's our market niche? Where can we have the greatest impact on community? So I think we're going to see more and more of this movement taking us to a place where our purpose statements are more focused and they're not everything for everyone all the time. And in addition to that, I share this insight. I won't tell you all the backstory, but essentially this really illustrates the importance of us thinking differently about cost recovery. First and foremost, full cost recovery is not a four-letter word. Cost recovery is not a four-letter word. It simply means recovering costs. And what we're going to find over time is that we're going to see more organizations having to have more of their service menu in a full cost recovery expectation mode, because we're going to see less resource from the general fund and less taxpayer dollars being invested, in contrast to how much we're going to need to sustain our systems. Alternatively, we're going to start exploring more profit center or enterprise opportunities, the things where we know demand is going to justify supply. People are going to be willing to pay for certain kinds of services, allowing us to generate excess revenues, AKA profit. We're always afraid to say the P word in the public sector, but profit that we can reinvest in our systems, right? In our infrastructure, in equity and inequities in our communities, addressing needs in our communities. At the same time, we understand that we have certain services that must have subsidy in order to survive. Our public parks have to have subsidy. Our yoga classes do not, right? Our public parks have to have subsidy. Our mommy-daughter or mother-daughter, father-son activities, our special events, breakfast with Santas, do not have to have subsidy. We've got to be thoughtful and understand that we've got certain services that rely on subsidy dollars. Unless we plan on putting wrought iron gates and toll booths at our parks, that is going to be our reality for the foreseeable future. And then finally, we're going to recognize that there are certain services we probably shouldn't be in the business of providing. Maybe there are other providers out there doing it better. Maybe they simply don't make sense. They don't align with our realities any longer. And we likely are just going to have to gracefully exit those services. But the opportunity there is that we can take those resources, those savings, if you will, and reinvest them back in the system. So at the end of the day, it allows us to think in a more holistic way, right, about our organizations and institutions as motherships, rather than us working in silos. I'm an adult sports coordinator and we make money and we should be able to keep it. We've got to get past that, and we've got to understand we've got to reinvest in our own systems again, because we know that taxpayer resources are going to become less and less available to us moving forward. So with that, that's a roller coaster ride in and of itself in terms of content. But we've got, I think, 5 minutes left, a sweet spot for general thoughts, comments, questions. I'm going to pass the mic back to Allison so she can take control here and maybe facilitate any Q&A that we have. Or again, I emphasize, if some of you are doing some really great stuff around this topic and you want to share what you're doing with the colleagues on the line, I encourage you to do so.
Thanks, Jamie. So questions are open. You can either write them in the chat box, you can put them in the question in the control panel, or if you're feeling up to it, I'm happy if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you on my end. And if you want to, as Jamie said, share a question or comment or thought on something that your agency is doing, we can do that as well. Oh, I have JJ with a raised hand. JJ, I will unmute you on the side. You are unmuted, but you do have to unmute yourself if you want the floor.
There,
There
can
you
you hear
go.
me?
Yep.
Awesome. Hey, Jamie. I actually just started a new position in a new role, a new leadership role, just about 4 weeks ago. And so, kind of curious what your thoughts and advice might be on how far back and how detailed into kind of the financial information of products and services and programs would you recommend going to really get a good grasp? And your answer could also be helpful for those maybe that are just starting into this as well. So yeah, love to hear your thoughts on that because I'm going to be very busy trying to gather that information. I've done the first 3 years. Want to see maybe if you thought 3 years was sufficient or maybe even further back than that.
So first of all, JJ, congratulations. I saw your new appointment. So well done, young man.
Thanks.
So, you know, I hate to use this. It's kind of a cop-out answer. It depends. First of all, if the organization for which you work, regardless of whoever this question may resonate or this comment may resonate with, don't have quality data, I wouldn't go any further back than a year. If there's quality data, you may want to look at maybe a couple of years. I would not go back more than 3 years because obviously cost of doing business has changed. So the relevance, I think, becomes a question mark. Minimally 1 year. And right now, given all of the other demands that are placed on every one of you with the crisis management you're in the midst of, I think that's a very reasonable and realistic small bite to take, and it will give you a complexion, some kind of complexion of the system's realities. But I do caution you, if you are questioning the credibility and the quality of your data, you may want to start fresh, right? So just keep that in mind. But I think 1 year is reasonable and realistic in this moment. It gives you, again, a sense, it's kind of a taste and flavor and feel for where the system is and what the costs are today, if you can look at 2019. But we all know 2020 is going to look very different. So if you can look back at 2019, I think it's a great baseline from which to begin. It's a good question.
Thanks.
Thanks, JJ. Let's see. I have a question here from Christy Bass. At the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that there are not enough financial acumen in the profession. What suggestions do you have for people in the field to develop those skills?
Oh, Christy Bass from Asheville. So very directly and succinctly, programs that are focused on business acumen and finance. And I will say, and I know this is going to sound very critical, but it is. I'd like to see our national association focusing more on financial discipline and financial acumen and business acumen and putting as much energy into that than we do on innovative programs and other kinds of topics that, frankly, not that they're not relevant, but I think they're just a bit less important in this moment than us having a strong sense of business acumen in our profession and in our world. Very specifically in your organizations, it may simply be, all staff being engaged in budget conversations and all staff understanding what is cost recovery and what is it not, all staff understanding pricing strategies, all staff understanding what market means and what competition means and so on. So I think anything we can do, either self-directing education and training opportunities internally or exposing them to opportunities outside of the organization, whether it's through your state associations or our national association, is going to only help that cause. But I think our professional associations, our state and our federal or our national association just need to do a better job of making this content, not this content from this session, but the topic of financial discipline and business acumen more prevalent and a bigger part of our training for our professionals and our organizations across the U.S.
Thank you, Jamie. I have another question here from Jennifer. You mentioned going back 1 year to the first question, to JJ's question. Would you be Would that be one normal year as past COVID year, or would that be different?
Yeah, great question, Jennifer. I would suggest 2019, even at the conclusion of 2020, unless you happen to be among the minority who went untouched and unscathed in 2020. And I can't imagine there's one organization today that didn't have to modify their service delivery menus. So I would look at 2019, but I would also look at 2020 because it may present you with an opportunity to see things differently. In particular, many of you provided services in 2020 that you didn't in 2019 that you may continue in 2021. So it may behoove you to look at 2019 as your comprehensive analysis, but then at the conclusion of 2020, don't dismiss or disregard the value of some of the services you provided that you may continue to provide into the future. So I think, normal year, funny way of thinking about it, but yeah, I definitely look back at 2019 as my baseline.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Jennifer. I don't see any other questions coming in, not so far. I'll give you guys all a couple more minutes in case you do. To wrap it up, I hope next week we'll be taking a week off from our 3-part webinar series, but we'll be back in 2 weeks, so after Thanksgiving, with a Q&A session with Farrell Buller, who's the Deputy Town Administrator for the Town of Erie. And we'll be looking at decision-making, so how to influence decision-making within your agency. All right, just taking another quick look at questions here. I got a lot of thank yous here coming in, Jamie, from James, from JJ. And I don't see any more questions. So Jamie, I'll pass it off to you to wrap it up.
Great, thanks, Allison. As you all are beginning to exit, just real quickly, thank you for your time, your attention today, your interest in this really critical topic. But I also want to express my gratitude and appreciation to all of you in the field. I say this every opportunity I have. You're doing some really tough work right now in the midst of really tough circumstances. And as a colleague and a friend to some of you, actually, and a former practitioner, I just want you to let you know how grateful I am for all of the work you're doing for the profession and for the communities you serve. So thank you for that. Enjoy the rest of your day.